Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. I took the night shift at the museum for one reason. I needed a job that didn't ask too many questions. Before this, I was a forensic artist. I spent years reconstructing faces from skulls, sketching missing persons, helping families find closure. Then I failed the one case that mattered most. A serial killer was hunting in my city, leaving behind bodies with their faces destroyed. I was supposed to put those faces back together, identify them, stop him before he struck again. But I didn't. One of those bodies belonged to my sister. I quit after that. Moved 3 states away, buried myself in a job where no one needed me to remember faces. Security work isn't complicated. Show up, patrol, log any incidents, lock up, that's it. The museum wasn't exactly hiring top-of-the-line professionals either. Just some guy willing to stay awake through the night and keep the place from burning down. It was an easy enough gig until I stepped into the security office on my first shift and saw the rules. They were scrawled across the wall in jagged, uneven letters. Dried blood stained the edges, like someone had carved the words into the surface with bleeding fingers. These rules will keep you alive. Ignore them, and you'll join the faces. I should have walked out right then. Should have handed in my keys and left. But I didn't. Maybe I was too tired to care. Maybe I wanted to believe it was some leftover Halloween prank, something the last guard wrote to screw with the next guy. Or maybe deep down, I wanted something to distract me from my own ghosts. Either way, I stayed, and I read the rules. Rule 1, do not touch the portraits in the Hall of Forgotten Faces. They will touch you back. Rule 2, if you hear laughter in the hall, cover your ears and hum until it stops. The laughter is not human. Rule 3, never look directly at the portrait of Abigail Blackwood. Her eyes will follow you, even after you leave. Rule 4, if the temperature drops suddenly, leave the hall immediately. Something is breathing down your neck. Rule 5, do not read the names on the plaques aloud. The names will call out to you in your dreams. Rule 6, if a portrait changes expression, burn it before sunrise. If you fail, it will step out of the frame. I read them twice, 3 times. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. Some kind of initiation hazing, maybe. A sick joke from the last guy on the shift. But something about those words, the smeared blood, the uneven handwriting, they unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. I glanced at the clock. Midnight. Outside, beyond the security office door, the museum sat in perfect stillness. Dim emergency lights cast long shadows over antique display cases, glassy reflections stretching across the floor. The air smelled like old wood, dust, and something else. Something faint, something almost metallic. I had 6 hours to kill, and I had no idea that by sunrise I'd believe every single one of those rules. The Hall of Forgotten Faces is at the far end of the museum, past the main exhibits. It's a narrow room with dark wooden walls, the kind that seem to absorb sound. The portraits hang in neat rows, each framed in thick, ornate gold. Their faces, men, women, even a few children, are frozen in expressions of quiet misery. Some glare in defiance, others look hollowed out, their eyes sunken and empty. The museum claims they're representations of accused witches, people who were lost to history. But standing here under the dim track lighting, I don't believe that. They don't feel like recreations. They feel like something else. I keep moving. The museum might be a relic, but my job is still security, which means keeping things clean. Dusting, wiping down cases, making sure nothing looks out of place. The portraits, though, something about them makes me hesitate. The dust clings to the frames like no one's touched them in years. I grab a cloth from my belt and reach for the nearest frame. I tell myself I'll just wipe the edge, keep my fingers away from the canvas itself. Then my hand slips. It's barely a touch, just a brush of my knuckle against the paint. The surface feels strange, not quite like dried oil paint, not quite like fabric, something in between, something warm. I jerk my hand back. A shiver rolls down my spine, but nothing happens. The portrait stays the same. Just a man in 18th century clothes, his face cast in shadow. I shake my head and exhale. Get a grip, Marcus. It's a painting. A goddamn painting. Still, I finish up quickly and leave the hall, resisting the urge to wipe my hand against my pants. Hours pass. At around 3 a.m., I make my rounds again, walking the length of the museum. The air is colder now, not enough to see my breath, but enough to make me rub my arms through my jacket. I pass the Hall of Forgotten Faces and pause at the entrance. Something feels different. I take a cautious step inside, my boots scuffing against the old wooden floor. The portraits are waiting, their eyes dark in the dim light. I tell myself it's fine, that nothing's changed. Then I feel it. A hand, cold fingers wrap around my shoulder, firm, unmoving. Not squeezing, not pulling, just there. Every muscle in my body locks up. I can't move, can't breathe. My pulse hammers in my ears. The grip is ice cold, seeping through my jacket, through my shirt, into my skin. I twist around, shoving myself backward, my breath coming in short gasps. There's nothing there. No one, just the empty hallway behind me. I swallow hard, forcing myself to stay calm. My fingers twitch toward my radio, but I don't press the button. What the hell would I even say? Then my eyes flick back to the portraits, and I see it. The painting I touched earlier, the man in shadow, has changed. His hand, once tucked at his side, is now extended outward, fingers curling toward the edge of the frame. Reaching. For me, a sharp chill spreads through my chest. My first instinct is to look away, but I force myself to stay still, to study the details. Maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe it was always like that. But no. The dust line on the glass shows exactly where his hand used to be. It moved. I don't know how long I stand there, my heart pounding, before I finally force myself to leave. I don't run, don't even speed up my steps. I just walk. Slow, controlled. Because if I run, it means I believe it. I make my way back to the security office, sit down and force myself to breathe. The rules flash through my head. Rule 1, do not touch the portraits in the Hall of Forgotten Faces. They will touch you back. I believe it now. After what happened with the portrait, I kept my distance. I still did my job, still patrolled, still checked the exhibits, but I avoided the Hall of Forgotten Faces unless I had to pass through. And when I did, I moved fast. No stopping, no looking too long at the paintings, no touching anything. But on the fourth night, something changed. I was making my rounds like usual, flashlight in hand. Then, as I passed the entrance to the hall, I heard it. Laughter. Faint. Just a whisper of sound at first. A child's giggle, high and airy, curling through the dark like a breeze. I froze. My first thought was that someone had broken in, that maybe some kids were messing around, playing hide-and-seek in the museum after hours. But no one had tripped the alarms. No motion sensors had gone off. And even if someone had slipped inside, what kind of person laughs like that in the dark? A sick, crawling feeling settled in my stomach. I didn't wait. I did exactly what the rules said. I clamped my hands over my ears and started humming, low and steady. Just noise to drown out whatever the hell was happening. The laughter didn't stop. It grew. It curled around me, slipping between my fingers, pressing into my skull like fingers digging into soft clay. I hummed louder. The giggling turned into something else. A deeper sound, layered, distorted, like dozens of voices laughing all at once. Like someone playing a recording on an old, warped cassette. My head ached. My pulse pounded against my ribs. The sound was inside me now, rattling in my chest, vibrating against my teeth. I pressed my hands harder against my ears. It didn't help. The laughter wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was in my head. I staggered back, slamming into the wall. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. The sound was unbearable, drilling into my skull, rattling behind my eyes. Then, silence. Just like that, the laughter stopped. I gasped, blinking hard, trying to shake the static fuzz from my vision. My hands trembled as I lowered them from my ears. That's when I saw the blood. Dark, warm streaks covered my palms. Thick drops dripped down my wrists. My ears were wet, my skin sticky. I touched the side of my head. The moment my fingers brushed my ear, a sharp pain lanced through my skull, making me hiss through clenched teeth. I pulled my hand back and stared at the blood smeared across my fingertips. It wasn't a little. It wasn't some small, harmless nosebleed. My ears were bleeding. I pushed off the wall, my balance unsteady, and forced myself to walk, not run, back to the security office. I didn't look back at the hall, didn't listen for anything else. Didn't breathe until I shut the office door behind me and locked it. Then I grabbed a roll of paper towels, pressed them to my ears, and sat there in silence, my heart hammering against my ribs. The rules weren't just warnings, they were survival instructions. Rule 2. If you hear laughter in the hall, cover your ears and hum until it stops. The laughter is not human. I did everything right. I followed the rule, and it still got in. I didn't go back into the Hall of Forgotten Faces for 2 nights after the laughter incident. I stuck to my rounds, keeping my head down, ignoring the gnawing unease in my gut. The museum felt heavier now, like it had noticed me. But I told myself I was being paranoid, that the rules, no matter how unsettling, were just rules. That changed on the 3rd night. It started with a draft. I was doing a standard walkthrough, checking the locked doors and making sure no one had wandered in during closing hours. Everything was normal until I reached the hall. A cold breeze brushed against my arm. Not unusual, I thought at first. Old buildings had drafts, but there was no open window, no vents nearby, and the air didn't move like normal air. It slid against my skin, slow and deliberate, like fingers trailing down my arm. I stopped walking. My flashlight beam hovered over the portraits, each one locked in their frozen expressions. I swallowed hard, scanning the hall for anything out of place. That's when I noticed it, a shift. One of the frames on the far wall was slightly ajar, barely noticeable, just a sliver of darkness peeking from behind the edge. It was a portrait of an old man with hollow eyes and a mouth set in a permanent frown. I didn't recognize him, not one of the faces I'd memorized. But the frame was different, off. I stepped closer, my boots making the floor groan beneath me. The moment I touched the edge of the frame, it swung open with a quiet creak. Behind it was a door. I hesitated, heart pounding. The museum layout didn't show any hidden rooms here. This wasn't part of the tour. I shouldn't have found this, but I did. And part of me, some stupid, reckless part, needed to know why. I pushed the door open. The hidden room was small, barely more than a closet. Dust coated every surface, thick enough to muffle the sound of my steps. The air was stale, laced with the faint scent of old paper and something sour beneath it, like decaying wood. A single table sat in the center, and on that table was a sketchbook. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, walk away, shut the door and pretend I never saw it. But my hands were already moving before my brain caught up. I flipped the cover open. The first drawing stopped my breath. It was a portrait, a woman's face, delicate and precise, like it had been sketched with careful, practiced strokes. The detail was immaculate, every strand of hair, every fine wrinkle around her eyes. But it wasn't just any woman, it was my mother. I turned the page. Another portrait, my father. Page after page, my family stared back at me, each sketch perfect, too perfect. The shading, the weight of the lines, it looked like my own work. But I had never drawn these. Then I noticed the labels. Beneath each face, a date was scrawled in uneven, jagged writing. Some of the ink was smudged, like the pen had been dragged across the page too quickly. My mother's portrait had a date. My father's did too. They were the dates they died. My chest tightened. I could barely breathe. Hands shaking, I turned the final page. The last drawing made my stomach drop. It was me. The sketch was recent. Fresh pencil marks still smudged the edges. My own face stared back, the detail so sharp it could have been a mirror reflection. Every crease in my brow, every tired line under my eyes, it was perfect. And underneath it, written in that same jagged script, was a date, tomorrow. A floorboard creaked behind me. I slammed the book shut and whipped around, my flashlight beam slicing through the room. Nothing, just the dark, just the thick, suffocating silence pressing in around me. I didn't stay to check twice. I shoved the book back onto the table, turned and walked out, fast. I didn't run, but I wanted to. I pulled the door shut behind me and yanked the portrait back into place. The second it clicked into position, the draft stopped. The air went still, like the museum was holding its breath. I stood there for a long moment, my back pressed against the wall, my fists clenched. Tomorrow, the word echoed in my skull, sinking deep into my bones. The museum wasn't just watching me, it was counting down. After finding the sketchbook, I should have quit. Maybe I didn't want to believe what I saw. Maybe I convinced myself I was overtired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Or maybe, and this was the thought that kept me up during the day, I knew I had nowhere else to go. I came here to escape my past, but it seemed like the past had followed me. And now something else was following me too. It was late. I was doing another round, walking through the empty halls, my footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The museum was dead silent. The kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt intentional. Like everything was waiting. I reached the Hall of Forgotten Faces, gripping my flashlight tighter than necessary. The rules were burned into my brain by now. I kept my distance from the portraits, careful not to brush against them again. I didn't hum, didn't read the plaques, didn't look too long at anything. Then it happened. The temperature dropped. Not a small change. This wasn't the usual night chill of an old building. This was instant. 1 second, the air was normal, and the next, it was freezing. My breath curled in front of me, a thin cloud of vapor in the flashlight beam. I stopped walking. The cold pressed against my skin, sinking into my bones. It wasn't just the air, it was the floor, the walls. Everything around me seemed to contract, like the building itself had taken a breath. Then I felt it, a slow, deliberate exhale against the back of my neck. Not a draft, not a trick of the air. Breath, cold, wet, too close. Every muscle in my body locked up. I wanted to turn around, wanted to lift my flashlight and shine it behind me, but something in my gut screamed at me not to. I took a step forward. The floor beneath my boots made a brittle crack. I looked down. A thin layer of ice had spread across the tiles, creeping outward like frost on a window pane. The intricate patterns stretched toward the portraits, weaving between them, reaching. Another breath on my neck. This time I moved. I bolted forward, gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. My boots skidded against the ice, my balance tipping for a split second before I caught myself. The cold chased me, the air thick with it, curling around my limbs like invisible fingers. I reached the hallway entrance. The moment I crossed the threshold, the cold stopped. The air snapped back to normal, warm compared to what I'd just felt. The ice didn't follow me past the doorway. It just stayed there, glistening in the dim light, like the hall itself had frozen over. I turned back, heart hammering. The portraits were unchanged, their expressions locked in time, their eyes staring ahead indifferent. But I knew better now. This place wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it had just tried to pull me under. I told myself I just needed to last until morning. One more shift, one more night. I was an idiot. I had started checking the portraits more often, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. The rules were all I had now, my only real defense. So when I noticed one of the paintings looked off, I stopped in my tracks. It was a man's portrait, one I was sure had been harmless before. Middle-aged, dressed in an old-fashioned black coat, neatly buttoned, his hair slicked back, his eyes kind. He'd always had a soft, knowing smile, the kind that made you think he was someone's grandfather. But now he was grinning, not the way he had before. This was wide, unnatural. His teeth were sharp, bared in something that looked more like a snarl. His eyes had changed too, no longer warm but hollow, dark. I felt my stomach tighten. Rule 6. If a portrait changes expression, burn it before sunrise. If you fail, it will step out of the frame. I moved fast. The museum kept a small emergency kit near the back office, first aid supplies, a flashlight, and most importantly, a lighter. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. When I got back to the hall, the man's face was still changing. His snarl had widened. His lips curled back farther than they should have, stretching past the limits of a normal human face. His eyes followed me as I approached. I flicked the lighter. A small, steady flame danced at the tip. I pressed it to the bottom corner of the painting. Nothing. The fire wouldn't catch. I tried again, holding the flame against the canvas longer. The heat licked at the edges, but the painting refused to burn. The fabric should have blackened, should have curled up into ash, but it just sat there, untouched. Then the lights in the hall flickered. A deep, creaking sound filled the room, like wood bending, like something moving. My breath stalled. I looked up just in time to see the man lift his hand inside the portrait. My brain refused to process it. He had been frozen, painted, nothing more than a captured image, except now his fingers were moving, stretching. The background of the painting seemed to peel away, shifting like liquid paint, and his other hand reached forward. Then he stepped out. The frame emptied. The man, the thing, was standing in front of me. His grin hadn't changed. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. My feet barely hit the floor as I bolted for the hallway, my lungs burning from the sudden sprint. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, not running, just following. I rounded the corner, gripping the lighter like it would somehow save me. My mind was racing. The rules said to burn the painting, but the painting wasn't there anymore. I needed to find another way. The museum was a maze at night, hallways stretching into endless loops, doors leading to nowhere. I turned down another corridor, past the gift shop, toward the emergency exit. I slammed my hand against the push bar. Locked. Why the hell was it locked? I twisted back, my pulse hammering against my skull. The hallway was empty. I couldn't see him, but I could feel him. The air was wrong. Then I heard it, slow, measured breathing. Not mine, right next to me. I turned my head just an inch and saw his reflection in the glass, standing close, too close. His smile was wider now, splitting his face into something inhuman. His eyes weren't hollow anymore, they were hungry. I didn't wait. I ran again, not caring where I went, just needing to get away. Somewhere behind me, I heard the sound of slow footsteps, always following. I didn't sleep the next morning. Even when the sun was up and the museum felt normal again, normal enough, I sat in the break room, gripping a cup of stale coffee I wasn't drinking. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I had to know the truth. I waited until the manager came in. He barely glanced at me as he set down his things, busying himself with opening procedures. "You look like hell," he muttered, typing something into his tablet. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I just stared at him, waiting for my own thoughts to settle into words. Finally, I asked, "Who painted the portraits in the Hall of Forgotten Faces?" He frowned. "What?" "The paintings," I pressed. "Who made them?" I expected him to scoff, maybe tell me I was wasting his time. Instead, he hesitated. Something in his face shifted. Just for a second, but I caught it. "They've always been here," he said finally. "Part of the original collection, donated, I think. Why?" I watched him carefully. "Do you know who they are?" He exhaled sharply, annoyed now. "I assume the same thing we tell the guests. Accused witches, people who vanished during the trials. That's the whole appeal of the place." But I wasn't buying it. "You assume?" The question made him pause again. His fingers hovered over his tablet, as if he was considering his next words. Then, after a beat, he let out a short laugh. "You're not the first guard to ask about them," he said, shaking his head. "Every so often, some night guy starts getting weird ideas, starts seeing things, hearing things." He looked at me then, finally meeting my gaze. "This place has a way of getting in your head." I swallowed, my throat dry. "What happened to the others?" The silence stretched too long. Then he sighed. "They quit." I didn't believe him, but I didn't press. Not yet. That night, I went digging. The museum's archives were a mess. Old boxes, unorganized files, yellowed paperwork stacked in corners. But if there were answers, they were here. I started with the oldest records, anything tied to the Hall of Forgotten Faces. But the deeper I went, the stranger things got. There was nothing on the artists. No documentation of who painted the portraits. No logs of when they were added to the collection. Just vague records dating back to the museum's opening. Then I found something. A file tucked away in the back of a drawer. Employee records, security staff. I opened it. The first few pages were standard contracts, nothing unusual. But as I flipped through, my breath caught. Photos, not of accused witches, of night guards. Men and women dressed in security uniforms, all staring stiffly at the camera. Some of the pictures were black and white, others were newer, printed in dull color. Dozens of them, pages and pages. I kept flipping. Then I stopped. One of the faces looked familiar, not from my shift, not from the break room, from the hall. My stomach turned. I recognized the soft, knowing smile, the neat black coat, the slicked back hair, the man who had stepped out of the frame. I flipped faster now, my fingers stiff. More faces, more portraits I had walked past every night. They weren't accused witches, they were security guards. Every single one. I barely registered my own movements as I stood up, knocking the chair back. My head was buzzing, my breath short. I needed to get out. I stumbled toward the door, but something stopped me. Another file. A single sheet of paper, loose, tucked near the bottom of the drawer. I picked it up. A name was written at the top. Abigail Blackwood. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scanned the text. Not an accused witch. Not a victim of the trials. The museum's founder. The woman who built this place. A woman who had died over a century ago, but still had a portrait hanging in the hall. My hands were shaking. The file with Abigail Blackwood's name was still in my grip, the paper crumpling slightly under my fingers. My breath was shallow, my thoughts racing. The Hall of Forgotten Faces wasn't a memorial. It wasn't a collection of accused witches. It was a prison. And Abigail Blackwood had built it. I turned on my heel and left the archive room, moving quickly through the empty museum. My boots echoed against the tile, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. I gritted my teeth. If I was going to end this, I had to break the rules. The hall was colder than I'd ever felt it. The moment I stepped inside, my breath misted in front of me. The portraits watched me. I could feel them. I moved toward the far end of the hall where her portrait hung. Abigail Blackwood. She sat in an old wooden chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Dressed in deep crimson, her dark eyes stared forward, calm and unreadable. For a long moment, I just stood there, my pulse pounding in my ears. Then, with a slow exhale, I broke Rule 5. I read her name aloud, Abigail Blackwood. The sound of my own voice felt wrong. The name didn't belong in the air. It didn't belong here. The temperature dropped instantly. Every candle in the hall flickered, their flames twisting violently before snuffing out completely. The darkness was instant, suffocating. Then, a voice. Soft, amused. I was beginning to think you'd never say it. The air around me shifted. My stomach twisted. A flickering glow lit up the hall, her portrait. The paint itself seemed to ripple, her face subtly shifting. The corners of her mouth lifted slightly, her dark eyes sharpening. "You're not like the others," she murmured. They ran. They begged. I couldn't move. The air felt heavier now, pressing against me like a thick fog. "But you came here for something else, didn't you?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to steady my voice. "I came for the truth." Her smile widened. "And now you have it." The portrait began to change. The colors bled like wet ink, swirling, reshaping. The chair vanished. The deep crimson of her dress darkened to black. Then she moved. Not like the others, not a slow, creeping shift. She stepped out. The sound was sickening, like something wet peeling from a surface. Her body twisted as she straightened, the fabric of her dress billowing slightly as she planted her feet onto the cold museum floor. She was real, and she was right in front of me. "You have a choice, Marcus." My whole body stiffened at the sound of my name. "You can walk away, free, untouched." She took a slow step closer. "All I ask is one thing." Her head tilted slightly, her dark eyes locking onto mine. A replacement. The hall was utterly silent. "Bring me another face." Her voice was so smooth, so calm, like she was offering me a business deal. "Someone to take your place." A sharp, cold weight settled in my chest. I didn't know what I had expected, some grand reveal, some twisted speech about my sins, my failures. But this was so much worse. She wasn't forcing me. She was offering me a way out. My stomach churned. I thought about my family, my failure to save them, the guilt that had followed me into this job, into this museum. And I knew right then why the others had disappeared. It wasn't just fear, it was temptation. How many had accepted? How many had gone free, leaving someone else to rot in the frames? I clenched my jaw. My fingers curled into fists. Then I spoke. "No." Her smile faltered. For the first time, her expression changed, just slightly, like she hadn't expected me to refuse. "Are you certain?" I didn't answer. Instead, I moved. I lunged toward the portrait. If her power was tied to the paintings, I had one shot: destroy it. But as soon as my fingers brushed the canvas, a shockwave of cold shot through me, sending me staggering backward. The air around the frame pulsed like something alive. I gritted my teeth. Fine. If I couldn't destroy it, I'd change it. I reached into my pocket, fingers closing around the one thing I did have, a pencil. The moment the graphite touched the canvas, she screamed. Not a human scream. Something deep, something ancient. The entire hall shook. I pressed harder, my movements fast and desperate, altering the delicate lines of her face. Shadows deepened. The soft curve of her lips twisted into something unnatural. I didn't need to ruin it. I just needed to make it wrong. She staggered, her form flickering, distorting. "Stop!" she shrieked. "You don't know what you're doing." But I did. I understood now. A forensic artist reconstructs faces, restores them, makes them whole. So what happens when you do the opposite? When you take a face and turn it into something unrecognizable? I slashed the pencil across the canvas, warping her features. Abigail let out one last piercing shriek, then silence. The cold lifted, and when I looked up, she was gone. I don't remember leaving the museum. 1 second I was in the hall, my hand clenched around the pencil, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The next, I was outside. The sun was rising over Salem, casting long shadows across the pavement. The museum stood behind me, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. as if it had all been a dream. But it wasn't. My clothes were damp with sweat, my hands were trembling, and the echo of Abigail's scream still rang in my ears. I staggered to my car, gripping the door handle like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I should have felt relief. I should have felt something. Instead, all I felt was cold. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The faces, not just Abigail, but all of them, the guards who had come before me, their empty, staring eyes, their twisted, silent expressions. They didn't move, didn't speak, but they watched. And in every dream, I stood in the hall again, with one more portrait than before. The next morning, I went back. I told myself it was to make sure, to prove to myself that it was over, that Abigail was gone, and the museum was just a museum again. But deep down, I already knew what I'd find. The Hall of Forgotten Faces was empty. Every portrait was gone. No dust-covered frames, no lingering traces of what had been there, just blank walls, as if the room had never held anything at all. For the first time since I took the job, the air didn't feel heavy. There was no cold breath on my neck, no distant laughter echoing through the halls. But something was there. One single portrait. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting. It was me, smiling. The expression was wrong. Too wide, too perfect. The kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. I took a slow step back, my breath unsteady. I wanted to run, I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move, because as I stood there, staring at my own face, it blinked. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.